You speak English.
Right.
You think in English.
Yeah,
You were probably listening to this deep dive in English right now.
most likely. Yeah.
But have you ever stopped, I mean, even for just a second, to consider what kind of operating system is actually running in your brain?
Oh, people almost never do.
Right. Because usually when we think about the language we speak every single day, we kind of treat it like a natural landscape.
Like a feature of the earth.
Yeah. Like a mountain or a river,
Yeah.
something that has just always been there, perfectly formed, rising organically out of the ground.
It is a very, very common illusion. We have this underlying assumption of, a pristine natural inheritance when it comes to our native tongues.
Right.
People just tend to view the language they grew up speaking as this sacred, almost unchangeable artifact. Like it was handed down from generation to generation in some pure, unbroken line.
But then you look at the actual history, which is exactly what we are doing today.
And it gets messy.
Vast. It's so incredibly messy. We have this massive stack of sources in front of us today. It's a really fascinating collection of linguistic, historical, and psychological notes.
Yeah, they really dig into the deep, hidden architecture of the English language.
And when you look at the blueprints in these notes, suddenly that pristine, majestic mountain looks a lot more like a chaotic, mud-soaked construction site.
It is the absolute definition of a Frankenstein monster.
The Frankenstein monster.
Totally. I mean, if you were going to design a logical, efficient way for human beings to communicate from scratch,
Yeah.
you would never, ever build English.
I love that. A Frankenstein operating system. And that is our exact mission for this deep dive.
Right.
We are absolutely not here to review grammar rules. We are not going to sit here and tell you when to use who versus whom.
No scolding about ending a sentence with a preposition.
Exactly. We are here to figure out exactly why this specific, bizarre language became the dominant practical tool of globalization.
Which is a wild story. It really is. Our goal is to reveal English not as this elegant inheritance, but as a highly flexible, incredibly messy working machine. One that has been repeatedly rebuilt, smashed apart, and stitched back together while people were still, actively trying to use it.
And that messy, patched-together history is exactly why it is so powerful today.
So it's a feature, not a bug.
Exactly. By understanding the mechanical history of how this language was cobbled together over centuries, you start to see how it actively shapes the way you think.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it shapes the way you structure an argument and even the way you experience the concept of time itself.
Okay, I can promise you, by the time we wrap up this deep dive, you will never look at your own emails, your favorite pop songs, or like the way you argue with your partner the exact same way again.
It really changes your perspective.
Totally. So before we can understand how English dictates our modern thoughts, we have to look at the factory floor.
Right, where it all started.
We have to look at how this machinery was built. And according to our sources, it wasn't built by scholars sitting in a quiet, candlelit laboratory.
Not even close.
It was forged through a brutal history of invasions, cultural collisions, and sheer, desperate, practical necessity.
Precisely. To understand the operating system, you have to look at the original source code.
Okay, let's unpack this. Where does the source code actually start?
Well, if we trace the roots back, English is fundamentally, at its absolute basement level, a West Germanic language.
West Germanic.
Yeah. Its deep ancestry runs through the massive Indo-European family, but the form we would even begin to recognize as the earliest ancestor of English started taking shape in Britain around the 5th and 6th centuries.
Okay, so a long time ago.
Right. This happened with the arrival of 3 specific Germanic tribes from what is now Germany and Denmark: the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes.
Let me stop you right there because I want to clear something up from our notes. I think there's a massive misconception out there.
Oh, definitely.
Because when people hear English, they often think of the Romans or they think of the native Britons. But Old English grew specifically from those Germanic dialects, right?
Yeah, that is a crucial distinction to make.
Yes, it did not grow from the Celtic languages that were already on the island. And it did not grow from Latin.
No, it didn't. The native Celtic languages, like the ancestors of modern Welsh or Scottish Gaelic, they were pushed to the geographic fringes of the British Isles by these Germanic settlers.
So they were just pushed aside.
Pretty much. And while the Romans had been in Britain for centuries prior to this, their Latin didn't morph into English either.
Right, because Latin morphed into French and Spanish and Italian.
Exactly. The foundation, the absolute bedrock of the English language, is purely Germanic.
Yeah.
If you were to listen to Old English today, you wouldn't think it sounded like Shakespeare. You would think it sounded like rough, ancient German or Dutch.
Wow. Okay, so we have this solid Germanic base. But then history happens.
Lots of history.
And for English, history basically meant a series of massive, traumatic, linguistic pileups.
Yes, linguists call these the contact language phases.
Contact language, meaning languages crashing into each other.
Exactly. English didn't develop in isolation. It developed by being repeatedly run over by other cultures.
So what was the first big crash?
First, you have the Christianization of England, which really kicks into high gear after the year 597.
Okay.
Suddenly, you take this rugged, tribal Germanic language and tie it directly to the immense international power of Latin learning and the Roman Catholic Church.
So you have Latin pouring in from the top down.
Right, giving them new words for religion, education, and architecture, things like bishop or altar.
Okay, but that's just some vocabulary on top of the Germanic base.
Yeah, that was just a warm-up, because in the 9th century, the Vikings arrive. And they don't just raid, they settle. They establish the Danelaw across a massive chunk of England.
So they're living right next door to the Anglo-Saxons.
Exactly. These Viking settlements bring a massive wave of Old Norse influence.
Right.
And because Old Norse and Old English were distant cousins, I mean, they were both Germanic languages, they started to bleed into one another in the everyday speech of farmers and traders.
Okay, so we've got Germanic tribes, Roman priests, and Viking farmers all mixing it up.
It's a crowded island.
It really is. But our notes highlight one specific year that changes absolutely everything. 1066.
Yes. The Norman Conquest.
Talk to me about 1066.
So William the Conqueror crosses the English Channel from France. He defeats the English King Harold at the Battle of Hastings and essentially takes over the entire country.
And from what the sources say, this isn't just a change in management. This is a total societal override.
Oh, it was incredibly sudden and absolute. Within just a few years, almost the entire English-speaking aristocracy was removed.
Removed and replaced.
Replaced by French-speaking Normans. Suddenly, the entire elite ruling class, the king, the lords, the judges, the bishops, they are all speaking a dialect of Old French.
Let me just try to visualize this, because this is where the operating system starts getting its really weird updates.
Yeah, put yourself in that environment.
Right, so you've got this island. The peasants and the farmers are speaking a mix of Old English and Norse. The clergy are reading and writing in Latin.
Right.
And the people holding all the swords and the money are speaking French.
That's the setup.
How does a single language actually survive that kind of intense pressure cooker without just collapsing into total incomprehensible noise?
It survives by doing something radical. It strips itself down.
It strips itself down.
It simplifies its own internal rules out of sheer necessity. This is what linguistic historians are pointing to when they classify English as a contact language.
Okay.
You have to imagine the daily, grinding reality of life back then. You have an English-speaking blacksmith trying to explain a broken horseshoe to a French-speaking knight.
Right. They have to talk somehow.
Or you have Norse-influenced traders trying to sell grain to English peasants. They all have to conduct basic business, trade goods, and just survive across these massive linguistic and class barriers.
Right. If I'm a peasant just trying to buy a chicken or trying to avoid getting taxed to death by a French lord, I am not going to pause the conversation to worry about perfectly conjugating my verbs.
Exactly. You don't have time for that.
I'm just going to point, grunt, and use the simplest words possible.
And that desperate pointing and grunting over decades is what physically altered the grammar.
Wow.
You see, Old English was what linguists call a heavily inflected language.
Inflected. Okay, let's unpack that. What does that mean in practical terms?
It means that the endings of the words themselves dictated their grammatical function.
So the end of the word changes.
Right. So if you had a noun, let's say king, the ending of that word would change depending on whether the king was doing the action, receiving the action, or owning something.
Wait, really? Just the ending of the noun?
Yes. It would also change if it was singular or plural. The words basically carried their own road signs. It was much more like modern German or Russian in that regard.
So because the words have these little directional tags on the ends of them, the grammar is doing all the heavy lifting.
Exactly. But here's the problem. When people from radically different linguistic backgrounds, like a Viking settler and an Anglo-Saxon farmer, are forced to communicate, those complex grammatical endings are the very first things to get lost in translation.
Oh, because they're too subtle.
They are too nuanced, yeah. Too difficult to sustain across the language barrier. If I know the root word for horse and you know the root word for horse, we're going to communicate.
Right, we'll get the point across.
But we are going to completely drop the complicated suffixes. The endings simply wear down from the friction of daily cross-cultural use.
So all those complex noun cases, all the complicated grammatical genders where, like, a table might be feminine and a rock might be masculine.
They'll just erode away.
Like sand on a beach.
They erode almost completely. But this creates an immediate structural crisis.
Why is it a crisis?
Because if you strip away all the little word endings that tell the listener who is doing what to whom, you still need a way to convey that vital meaning.
Oh, right. Otherwise, it's just a pile of random nouns and verbs.
Precisely. The language had to rely on something else. So English shifted its entire operating mechanism.
How did it do that?
It moved from relying on word endings to relying almost entirely on word order. Specifically, it locked into a very rigid subject-verb-object, or SVO, order.
Wait, let me make sure I'm wrapping my head around this. So it's like, okay, imagine you're laying down a railroad track.
Okay, I like that.
You have to put down the actor first, then the action, then the result. Point A, point B, point C. You can't deviate from the track.
That is a beautiful way to visualize it. Because it lost its inflections, modern English packages all of its meaning into physical position.
Position is everything.
Let's take a simple sentence. The child opened the door. Subject, verb, object. The actor, the action, the target. If you scramble those exact same words to the door opened the child, the meaning completely changes into something surreal and terrifying.
Because the position is the meaning.
Exactly. In a highly inflected language like Latin or Old English, you could scramble the order of those words almost any way you wanted.
Really? Anyway.
Pretty much. And the listener would still know the child was the actor because the word for child would have a specific actor ending attached to it. The words could float around the sentence.
But English lost those endings.
So it forces you onto that strict railroad track. It demands clear actors and clear verbs placed in a specific sequence to function.
That makes so much sense. We gave up the puzzle pieces that fit together perfectly, and we traded them for a strict assembly line.
A very strict assembly line.
And to make that assembly line work, looking at our notes here, we started relying heavily on prepositions.
Right, all those little directional words.
Things like in, on, under, through. And helper verbs, things like do, have, be, will, should.
Yes, we traded complex endings for a massive reliance on tiny structural words. They act like the glue in the hinges holding the heavy bricks of our sentences together.
Okay, so the grammar was highly streamlined out of necessity.
It was. But while the grammar was simplifying, another part of the language was becoming incredibly, infuriatingly messy.
Oh, I know where this is going.
Nothing illustrates that messiness better than English spelling.
Oh, man. The spelling. Let me tell you, reading the notes on English spelling was incredibly validating for me.
I think everyone feels that way.
Our sources literally refer to English spelling as historical debris, which is deeply comforting to anyone who has ever bombed a middle school spelling test.
It takes the blame off the student, for sure.
Because let's be honest, English spelling makes absolutely zero logical sense. You look at words like though, tough, through, thought. They all look the same, and they all sound completely different.
It is notoriously chaotic, but there is a very specific mechanical and historical reason why it makes no sense.
Please explain, because I need to know who to blame for this.
The timeline is key here. The language moves from Old English to Middle English. This is the period where the grammar simplifies and the French vocabulary pours in from the Normans.
Right.
But then we hit the transition into early modern English, around the 1400s and 1500s.
Okay.
This era brings the Renaissance, the translation of the King James Bible, and crucially, the introduction of the printing press by William Caxton.
Right, the printing press. Mass communication arrives.
But the printing press arrived at the exact same time as a massive, mysterious phonetic earthquake.
A phonetic earthquake.
Linguists call it the Great Vowel Shift.
The Great Vowel Shift. Whenever I hear that, it sounds like a tectonic plate snapping, but inside people's mouths. What actually was it?
It essentially was a tectonic shift in pronunciation. Over the course of a couple of centuries, the way English speakers pronounced their long vowels changed dramatically.
How so?
They started raising their tongues higher in their mouths when speaking. So before the shift, the word bite was pronounced like beat.
Wait, really?
Yeah, and the word out was pronounced like oot, The word house sounded like whose.
Whose. So it sounded almost Scottish or heavily northern.
Very much so. But over time, whose became house, beat became bite.
Okay, so pronunciation changes. That happens in all languages, right?
It does. But, and this is the absolute crux of the issue, this massive change in how people actually spoke happened right as early printers were locking standard spellings into place on the printed page.
Let me guess. The printers locked in the old spellings.
Precisely. They took a snapshot of the language based on how it used to sound.
Oh, no.
Or they based it on the chaotic, localized spellings of the scribes they had on hand, some of whom were Dutch, by the way, which added even more confusion.
Wow.
So the printing press locked the spelling in stone, but the everyday people in the streets just kept on changing how they actually spoke.
That is wild. So the written form stayed stubbornly frozen in time, reflecting these older medieval pronunciations and all these layers of French and Viking borrowing, while the spoken language just ran away from it?
It is a museum of past pronunciations.
A museum. I like that.
When you see the silent K in knife or the E in night, those aren't random letters thrown in to confuse you. People used to physically pronounce those letters.
Wait, they said the K in knife.
Yeah. A medieval speaker would have said KF and neat.
K, that sounds exhausting.
It's very Germanic.
So when I struggle to spell a word today, it really isn't my fault. I am quite literally wrestling with the historical ghosts of a language that refused to update its own software to match its new hardware.
You are fighting a 1,000-year-old battle every time you write a grocery list.
That is equal parts hilarious and frustrating. So we're walking around using a tool built by conquered peasants, conquering elites, and confused printing press operators,
Pretty much.
which creates a perfect bridge to the next massive quirk of this operating system. Because English didn't just inherit a messy spelling system from all those historical collisions.
No, it inherited a lot more than that.
According to the sources, it inherited two completely different emotional switchboards.
This is perhaps one of the most defining and unique characteristics of the English language.
The double vocabulary.
Exactly. Because of that layered history, the Germanic base, overlaid with the massive French influence from the Norman conquest, plus later waves of academic Latin English, has a deeply fractured vocabulary.
Fractured in what way? Let's look at the numbers from the notes.
Rough linguistic estimates suggest that only about a quarter of modern English vocabulary is Germanic in origin.
Okay.
Meanwhile, roughly 2/3 is Italic or Romance, meaning it derives from French and Latin.
Wait, hold on. A quarter Germanic, but 2/3 French and Latin.
Yes.
I always thought of English as a Germanic language. That is a staggering imbalance for a language that has a Germanic skeleton.
It is a massive imbalance. The grammatical skeleton, the prepositions, the conjunctions, the core everyday verbs we just talked about, that is all Germanic.
Right, the train tracks.
But the meat on the bones is largely French and Latin,
Hmm.
and this creates what linguists refer to as a double vocabulary.
A double vocabulary. So we have two words for everything.
Almost everything. For almost every concept in English, we have pairs of words, and they carry completely different social and emotional weights.
The sources gave some great examples of this, like ask versus inquire.
Perfect example. Ask is your ancient, blunt, everyday Germanic root. It's a word that has been in the mud for 1,000 years.
Right.
Inquire is your elevated Latinate overlay. It arrived later through the courts and the universities.
And you see this everywhere. Help versus assist. Start versus commence. Freedom versus liberty.
Yes.
It really is like having two entirely different keyboards attached to the same computer. I can type the exact same message, but the font feels totally different.
What's truly fascinating here is how this duality gives native English speakers an immediate instinctual register shift.
Register shift. What is register exactly?
A register in linguistics is basically the level of formality or social distance in your speech. Because of this historical layering, you can switch from an intimate, raw, blunt tone to a bureaucratic, distant, highly formal tone in a split second simply by swapping the lexical layer you are pulling from.
Let's play this out because I think we do this constantly without realizing it.
We do, every day.
I can sound poetic or clinical or corporate or street level without actually changing my grammatical railroad track at all. I just swap the words on the track.
Right. Think about the emotional distance in a very severe situation, like reporting a death.
Okay.
You could say, he died. That is the short, physical, visceral, Germanic core. It hits like a punch.
Right. It's blunt. But if I'm a doctor talking to a family, I might soften it. I might say he passed away.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or if you want to be completely detached, like a coroner, you might say he expired.
Oh, that's cold.
It is. Or stepping all the way into the cold Latinate bureaucracy of a police report, the individual is deceased.
Wow. The individual is deceased.
Same biological event, for completely different emotional distances. Very few languages have this kind of built-in instant register switch system embedded so deeply in their everyday vocabulary.
And the history of why we have this switchboard is completely wild, especially when you look at the language of food.
Oh, the food vocabulary is fascinating.
The notes point out that our food vocabulary is basically a fossil record of medieval class warfare.
It really is, and it goes right back to that dynamic after the Norman conquest in 1066.
Okay, take me back to 1066.
You had a sharply divided society. The laborers, the Anglo-Saxon peasants, were the ones out in the mud, raising the livestock, feeding them, slaughtering them.
Right, doing all the dirty work.
Because they were speaking Old English, they used their everyday Germanic words for the living animals. Cow, pig, sheep, calf.
Right. But the people who were actually eating those animals, sitting in the dry, warm castles, were the French-speaking elite.
Exactly. The lords didn't interact with the muddy animal. They only interacted with the roasted dish brought to their table.
So the words split.
Yes. The cooked meat took on the French-derived prestige names. Beef from the French boeuf, pork from pork, mutton from mouton, veal from veau.
That is incredible. The language literally remembers who did the dirty work and who got to dine.
Exactly.
The peasants raised the cows. The lords ate the beef.
It is a permanent record of social inequality baked into our daily menus.
I am going to push back slightly on something we said earlier, though.
Okay, what's that?
We talk about how English simplified its complex grammar so peasants and lords could talk to each other.
We did.
But looking at this double vocabulary, didn't we just trade grammatical complexity for social complexity?
That is an interesting way to frame it.
Because we stopped using verb endings, sure. But now we use word choices to show who is the boss in a room, or who is educated, or who belongs to which social class.
That is a brilliant observation, and it is exactly what happened. We outsourced our social hierarchy.
Outsourced it.
Yes,
Well-
we moved it from the rigid structure of the grammar into the nuanced selection of the vocabulary.
That's wild.
And because English survived by mixing these different vocabularies, it developed a cultural mindset that treats outside influence differently than many other languages do.
What do you mean by that?
It treats foreign words not as a contamination of some pure sacred source, but as fresh inventory.
Endless absorbency. I loved looking at the list in our sources of all the words we just casually vacuumed up from across the globe over the centuries.
It's a long list.
It really is. Cafe from French, kindergarten from German, tsunami from Japanese, algebra from Arabic,
Right.
taco, sushi, chai, kimchi, shampoo, pajamas. We just grab them, naturalize them instantly, strip them of their original grammar, and pretend they've always been ours.
English operates on a very simple assumption. If a word is useful, it can and should be adopted.
No questions asked.
There is incredibly weak linguistic gatekeeping in the English-speaking world. Consider French, for example.
Right, they have a whole system for this.
They do. They have l'Académie Française. It's a formal, government-backed council that strictly regulates the language and tries to prevent English words from creeping in.
Like they ban words like email.
Right, exactly. They prefer Couriel. But
Mhm.
English has no equivalent academy. It is a marketplace language. It survives by absorbing whatever it needs to keep doing business.
Okay, so we have a language with a stripped-down railroad track grammar, a massive double-layered vocabulary that lets us switch social classes instantly, and a habit of stealing words from everyone else.
That's the operating system in a nutshell.
But a language isn't just a closet full of clothes you put on to sound a certain way.
No, it goes much deeper than that.
Our sources argue that this structure actively dictates the shape of the thoughts you can have, which is a really heavy concept.
It's a huge shift in how we think about language.
So how does this Frankenstein machine actually shape human psychology?
Well, if we connect all these historical quirks to the bigger psychological picture, we find that the vocabulary and the syntax of a language provide the scaffolding for a culture's worldview.
The scaffolding for a worldview.
Yes. The words you have access to limit or expand what you can easily pay attention to. And English has plenty of words that are famously untranslatable.
Now, when you say untranslatable, I assume you don't mean that someone in Spain or Japan literally cannot comprehend the idea.
Correct. Other languages can absolutely explain the concepts using a phrase or a full sentence, but what makes these English words untranslatable is that English packs a massive, incredibly complex social or legal abstraction into a single everyday word that a 5-year-old can use.
Let's dig into the examples from the sources because they blew my mind. Take the word privacy,
Yes, privacy is a distinctly Anglo-American obsession.
because it's not just about being alone, right?
Exactly. It isn't just a word for solitude, it carries heavy cultural baggage. It implies a legally and socially valued protected sphere around the individual.
Like a bubble.
A bubble that the state or your neighbors cannot cross. It reflects a culture deeply concerned with property rights and liberal individualism.
Right.
Try translating the full weight of the phrase invasion of privacy into a language that prioritizes collective harmony, and you'll find there isn't a direct one-to-one equivalent.
What about the word fair? I feel like fair is the very first concept an English-speaking child learns, like, Mom, that's not fair.
We use it constantly, but fair is a conceptually dense word.
How so?
It's this messy, intuitive mix of justice, balance, sportsmanship, decency, and procedural equality.
Right, it's not strictly legal justice.
No, but it's not just goodness either. It's an expectation that the rules of the game are applied equally to everyone.
Okay, I see that. What's another one?
Think about the word accountability,
Yeah.
another huge English buzzword.
Right, we need accountability.
It isn't just responsibility, it's answerability tied directly to public duty and judgment.
Okay, but my favorite example from the notes was the word awkward.
Oh, awkward is fascinating from a psychological standpoint.
Right, because awkward is that exact horrifying feeling when you wave at someone across the street who wasn't actually waving at you.
We've all been there.
And you suddenly have to pretend you were just stretching your arm or swatting a bee. It's this incredibly specific social panic. And the notes say other languages don't necessarily bottle that up into one adjective.
They often don't. Awkward encapsulates social friction, a mismatch of expectations, secondhand embarrassment, physical clumsiness, and practical inconvenience, all in one breath.
It's doing so much heavy lifting.
We use it for a heavy silence at a dinner party, a badly designed staircase, or a teenager going through puberty. It covers everything.
And consider the word compromise.
Yes, compromise is a great one.
In many languages, the closest word implies surrender or loss of integrity.
Yeah.
But in English, a compromise is largely seen as a positive, pragmatic, negotiated, partial agreement.
Exactly. These specific words reveal an English-speaking culture that is utterly obsessed with public negotiation, social boundaries, and procedural justice.
Procedural is definitely the key word there, because earlier we talked about that strict railroad track sentence structure.
The subject, verb, object.
Right. The agent, the action, the result. The note suggests this very grammatical structure creates an intense cognitive bias. English fundamentally demands to know who did what.
It absolutely does. And this is where the psychology gets really deep.
Okay.
Compared to languages that place the verb at the very end of the sentence, or languages like Spanish or Japanese that allow you to drop the subject entirely if it's understood from context.
English doesn't let you do that.
No, English requires you to put the actor and the action right up front. It unfolds reality in a linear, stepwise sequence.
Who is involved? What happened? What did it affect?
Yes, so it forces a procedural mindset.
Which makes the perfect language for writing legal contracts, or step-by-step journalism, or software documentation.
Exactly. You can't hide in the passive voice easily without it sounding clunky. It favors extreme clarity through sequencing.
Point A leads to point B.
Right. It chunks a chaotic reality into explicit actors and stepwise causation. It's a highly modular way of thinking and arguing. Here's the evidence, here's the conclusion.
Like, I really want to pull on this thread.
Sure.
If I am arguing a point in English, I'm essentially forced by my grammar to build a machine. Actor, action, result. Does this mean the language itself subtly nudges us as a culture to assign blame and take personal agency more intensely than people who speak other languages?
That is a big question.
It sounds like a wild stretch, but the sources seem to point right at it.
It is not a stretch at all in the field of cognitive linguistics. The structure nudges thought toward explicit actors. Let me give you a classic example from the research.
Please.
If a vase falls off a table and shatters,
Okay.
an English speaker is strongly grammatically pushed to say, he broke the vase, or John broke the vase.
Right. We want a culprit. John did it.
But in Spanish, for example, the more natural, common phrasing for an accident like that often utilizes a reflexive structure.
Which means what?
It might translate closer to "the vase broke itself" or "to John, the vase broke."
Oh, wow.
The language allows for the event to just be a thing that occurred, separating the person from direct, intentional blame for an accident.
That feels so much more forgiving.
It is, but English doesn't let you off the hook easily. It forces you to assign an agent. It expects the world to be driven by individuals making things happen.
Mind blown. So we are linguistically predisposed to point fingers.
In a way, yes.
And it doesn't just meticulously track who did it. According to our deep dive notes, it is absolutely obsessed with tracking how the action unfolds in time.
Yes, English marks time incredibly strongly through a complex system of what linguists call tense and aspect.
Tense and aspect.
English doesn't just care about the basic past, present, or future. It wants to know the precise duration of the event, its completion status, and its relevance to the current moment.
Let me see if I've got this. There's a huge psychological difference between saying, I worked, I was working, I have worked, and I have been working.
Huge difference.
But they all happened in the past. Yet they paint totally different pictures of the reality.
Precisely. I worked is a closed box. It's done.
Okay.
I was working is an interrupted process. You expect a when to follow it. Like, I was working when the phone rang.
Right.
I have worked means the past action gives you current experience, like on a resume. And I have been working means the sweat is still on your brow.
So it's hyper-specific about the status of the action.
That obsessive tracking of process makes English a highly project-oriented language. It's practically built for office schedules, static updates, and postmortems.
It is constantly narrating not just what happened, but whether the task is complete and whether it still matters right now,
Exactly.
which bleeds straight into our everyday idioms. I was looking at the list of idioms in the sources, and so many of them are entirely procedural or mechanical.
Like what?
Things like break the ice, get the ball rolling, cut corners, raise the bar, level the playing field, get on the same page.
They're very action-oriented.
We frame literally everything, even socializing, dating, or relaxing, as a task to manage, a mechanism to fix, or a sport to win.
That is the mental atmosphere of the English language. It is not a language built around maintaining a sacred, eternal, cosmic order.
Right.
It is a language built around pragmatic motion. Thinking in English feels like thinking in a language that fundamentally expects the world to be mobile, negotiable, and improvable.
It values usefulness and action over formal elegance or stasis.
Exactly.
Okay, so English is an incredible machine for arguing, writing software, managing projects, and assigning blame to people who break vases.
It really is.
It's a procedural hybrid powerhouse.
Yeah.
But I mean, we're humans. We don't just write contracts.
Right.
How does this specific, rigid operating system actually sound when we try to do something purely emotional with it? How does it sound when we make music or when we try to make each other laugh?
Structurally, English has a very distinct pulse, a specific rhythmic heartbeat that directly influences its music and its poetry.
A heartbeat.
Linguistically speaking, English is what is known as a stress-timed language.
Stress-timed. Okay, let's break that down.
As opposed to what?
As opposed to a syllable-timed language,
Yeah.
like Spanish, French, or Japanese.
Okay, and what's the difference?
In a syllable-timed language, every single syllable takes up roughly the exact same amount of time to say. It has a very even, machine gun-like pattern, da-da-da-da-da.
Very steady.
But in English, the rhythm is not organized around the number of syllables. It is organized around the stressed, emphasized beats.
So it's not a machine gun, it's a drum set.
Highly percussive, yes. The heavy beats fall naturally on the stressed syllables, and all the unstressed syllables in between get rapidly compressed, swallowed up, or turned into a neutral sound just to fit the timing.
Wait, can you give me an example of that?
Sure. If I say, the cat chased the mouse, or the cat might have chased the mouse, the time it takes to say both sentences is roughly the same.
Even though the second one has way more words.
Yes.
Because the heavy beats on satin mouse dictate the rhythm. Everything else is just filler that gets compressed between those beats.
That makes English incredibly bouncy. And the notes mention it has a very heavy consonant texture, too. Lots of hard T's, K's, and P's.
Yeah.
It gives the language a real physical attack.
It does, and this makes English extraordinarily compatible with forms of music that are driven by a strong pulse and a backbeat.
Like rock music, pop hooks, rap, and spoken word. The language itself has a built-in backbeat.
Exactly. Rock and roll phrasing rides those accent patterns naturally. The vocal flow in hip-hop absolutely thrives on the syncopation and the elastic compression that a stress-timed language allows.
Because you can squeeze words in.
You can cram 5 syllables into a space or stretch one out as long as you hit the heavy stress on the downbeat.
That's amazing.
And because English has that massive dual vocabulary we discussed earlier, the Germanic and the Latin songwriters and poets have an enormous, deep pool of synonyms to pull from.
Right. If a lyricist needs a harsh, aggressive, one-syllable word to drop like a hammer on the downbeat, they pull from the Germanic side.
Exactly.
If they need a flowy, multi-syllable word to stretch across a melody, they pull from the French or Latin side. They can chase a rhyme or shift the entire mood of a song without fundamentally changing the core message.
It gives artists incredible stylistic range.
But what about humor? Because comedy is also entirely about timing and tone.
English humor is deeply, deeply reliant on the language's specific structural and historical quirks. Much of English language comedy thrives on understatement, deadpan delivery, irony, and a concept linguists call register clash.
Register clash. I love this concept. Let's dig into this because this explains so much of the internet.
It really does.
We have that grand, formal Latinate layer of words and that blunt, muddy Germanic layer. So register clash is when we smash them into each other on purpose for comedic effect.
Precisely. You take a grand, formal, highly bureaucratic phrase and drop it into a completely trivial, everyday, messy situation.
Like saying, I have commenced the consumption of the pizza.
Exactly. Or, conversely, you use a blunt, raw, one-syllable Anglo-Saxon word to suddenly puncture an inflated, pretentious speech.
It's like a CEO in a tailored suit slipping on a banana peel. The comedy literally comes from the collision of the language's historical layers.
Yes, the irony is baked into the vocabulary choice.
That's so good.
But if we look at the darker side of our social interactions, how we insult each other, the sources point out something truly fascinating about what English speakers actually choose to attack when they are angry.
Yeah, if you analyze common English insults, you notice a really distinct, almost revealing pattern.
They overwhelmingly target a person's competence, their authenticity, and their social behavior.
Let's look at the actual words.
Okay.
Idiot, moron, fake, poser, useless, clueless, incompetent, full of yourself, out of line.
Notice what is conspicuously absent from that list.
What?
While insults based on family, lineage, or honor certainly exist on the fringes, the most common, everyday, deeply felt English insults are direct attacks on individual performance and credibility.
Wait, hold on. I'm connecting the dots here.
Yeah.
We don't insult someone's ancestors or their family honor nearly as much as we insult their personal capability because of the agent-action-result worldview.
Exactly.
English-speaking cultures are generally highly individualistic. We are obsessed with status competition and utility. So our deepest cultural anxiety is being seen as useless, incompetent, or fake.
That is a phenomenal connection.
Our insults reflect exactly what our grammar tells us is important: individual agency.
The insult targets the agent's failure to perform the action competently. And this intense focus on individual status brings up another major operational quirk of English:
What's that?
how it handles politeness, deference, and social hierarchy.
Right, because earlier I pointed out that we use vocabulary to show class. But grammatically, unlike languages such as Japanese or Korean, English doesn't have a formal, rigid, grammatical honorific system built into the verbs.
No, that's...
I don't have to use a completely different complex verb conjugation when I am talking to my boss versus when I'm talking to my best friend at a bar.
That is true. English shed most of its explicit grammatical markers for status a long time ago. We don't even use thou and you to distinguish intimacy anymore. We just use you for everyone.
Right.
But that absolutely does not mean English is socially flat or egalitarian. It just means English outsources its hierarchy to more subtle tools. Specifically, it uses modal verbs, hedging, and those register shifts we talked about.
Modal verbs. Let's define those for the listeners. These are the could, would, might, should words.
Exactly. Instead of changing the grammar of the word to show respect, an English speaker changes the degree of directness. It is all about how softly you approach the subject.
Give me an example.
Let's look at a basic command in a workplace. You could say, send me the file.
Okay.
That is structurally simple, blunt, Germanic, and it implies you hold absolute authority over the person.
But if I am talking to a client or a boss or someone I need a favor from, I am never going to say that.
Never.
I am going to say, could you send me the file? Or if I'm really treading carefully and trying to be hyper-differential, I might say, Would you mind possibly sending me the file when you get a chance?
The core action is exactly the same. I want the file, but the hierarchy signal is entirely different.
Because I'm cushioning it.
By adding all those modals and conditional layers, would, mind, possibly, you are creating artificial distance. Because English outsources politeness to tone and phrasing rather than strict grammar, social status becomes deniable. It is hidden in the subtext.
And it requires constant, exhausting calibration.
It really does.
You have to be blunt enough to get your point across, but soft enough to be socially acceptable. You are constantly adjusting those modal dials based on exactly who is in the room.
Right.
It makes social interaction in English feel incredibly nuanced and honestly sometimes exhausting because the power hierarchy is covert rather than overt. You have to read the room constantly.
And that covert hierarchy, that highly adaptable, pragmatic power map encoded into the way we soften or harden our speech, is exactly the kind of utility that drove this language out of a small, cold island and across the entire planet.
Which brings us to the grand scale, the empire of Englishes.
Yes.
We have spent the first half of this deep dive looking at the internal mechanic, the wires and gears of the operating system. But how did this specific, quirky, messy, inconsistently spelled system actually conquer the globe?
It's a huge question.
Because, spoiler alert, it was not because everyone in the world took a look at English spelling and thought, wow, what an elegant, logical language.
Not at all. It didn't win on linguistic merit. But the numbers today are absolutely staggering.
What are the numbers?
According to the 2025 figures from Ethnologue, there are roughly 1.49 billion English speakers worldwide.
1.49 billion.
That makes it the most spoken language on Earth. But here is the profound, historically unprecedented part. There are far, far more second language speakers of English than there are native speakers.
Let that sink in for a second. English no longer belongs primarily to the people who speak it natively.
Exactly.
The vast majority of people speaking English right now learned it as a second tool. That is wild.
It functions today not as a treasured cultural artifact owned by England or America, but as shared global infrastructure. And this massive spread happened in very distinct, historically power-driven phases. It didn't spread because people thought Shakespeare sounded nice. It was carried and often forced by massive institutions of power.
Right. Our sources break this down into 4 phases. Phase 1 is the British Empire.
The colonial era.
Right. As the sources outline, English was forced outward across the globe to North America, India, Africa, Australia, the Caribbean, through colonial administration, the establishment of English-speaking legal systems, the military, and global trade routes.
It became the language you had to speak if you wanted access to the courts or the governing power.
So as a tool of administration and domination.
Yes.
Then the sources point to Phase 2, the Industrial Revolution, which was heavily centered in Britain. So suddenly, English isn't just the language of the colonial governor, it is the language of scientific advancement, engineering, and massive economic prestige.
Correct. It became economically necessary to engage with English if you wanted to participate in the new industrial economy.
And Phase 3.
Then you transition into the 20th century. Following the World Wars, the British Empire wanes, but the United States emerges as the dominant global military and economic superpower.
Right.
The center of gravity shifts to America, but the language remains the same, amplified by American corporate power and international diplomacy.
And now we are living in Phase 4, which is arguably the most pervasive.
Pop culture.
Pop culture, Hollywood, the global music industry, and crucially, the internet. Software architecture was largely written in English. The algorithms, the early coding languages, the meme culture, they have completely entrenched English as the default operating system of the digital world.
This sequence of immense power transfers is the central political fact about the English language.
It's all about power.
It opens doors across borders. It allows a coder in Berlin to collaborate with a designer in Tokyo. But we cannot ignore the flip side.
Which is?
As the notes point out, it is also a massive bulldozer that continually pressures local indigenous languages into secondary status or drives them toward extinction.
That's a really dark reality to acknowledge.
And within this story of spread, our sources demand that we address the very specific myth, the myth of Standard English.
Ah, Standard English. This is the deeply ingrained idea that there is one pure, correct, pristine, neutral way to speak the language, and that everything else, every other dialect or accent, is just a cute regional quirk at best or a sign of poor education at worst.
That concept is a pure political construction. Standard English did not fall from the sky.
How was it created then?
It was forcefully engineered into existence over centuries. It was solidified by those early printing presses, standardizing the chaotic spelling in London. It was reinforced by the administrative power of the London courts.
Okay.
It was drilled into people by elite, private schooling systems. And in the 20th century, it was cemented by institutions like the BBC, which broadcast a very specific, carefully curated prestige accent across the airwaves.
You were talking about RP received pronunciation, the classic, crisp, posh British accent, the James Bond accent.
Yes. Received pronunciation became the ultimate prestige accent in the UK, deeply associated with elite public schools, Oxford, Cambridge, and the upper classes.
Right.
But demographic research points out a stunning reality. Only a tiny minority of people in Britain, historically around 2 to 3%, actually speak pure RP natively.
Wait, so the dialect that has been treated for a century as the neutral, professional, baseline standard for the English language is actually a massive, elite minority dialect.
Exactly. This is why linguists say that dialects in English are power maps.
Power maps.
They are not just different ways of pronouncing vowels, they signal class, education, and aspiration. The form that society treats as neutral or proper is actually deeply loaded with class power.
That makes total sense.
The way you speak instantly reveals who society automatically assumes is competent, respectable, and professional versus who is immediately deemed provincial, untrustworthy, or uneducated.
Standardization followed power. The people with the money and the printing presses decided that the way they spoke was the standard, and everyone else was a deviation.
Exactly.
That is such a crucial takeaway. And because English spread so widely, backed by all this power, we can't even really talk about it as a single unified language anymore, can we? The sources specifically insist on using the plural, Englishes.
Absolutely. The British Council and modern sociolinguists explicitly discuss the reality of global Englishes. We are no longer just talking about British versus American.
Right, it's way bigger than that.
We are talking about Indian English, Nigerian English, Caribbean English, Singaporean English, Australian English, and it is vital to understand that these are not just fun, colorful local accents layering over a London standard.
Right. They are distinct, fully realized social worlds. They have their own massive vocabularies, their own grammatical innovations, their own internal moral temperatures, their own rhythms, and their own intricate rules for politeness and formality.
Because English has always had this history of high tolerance for borrowing, mixing, and adapting, because it has no formal academy to freeze it in place, it mutates incredibly easily when it encounters a new environment.
So it adapts to wherever it lands.
So when the language took root in places like India or Nigeria over a century ago, it didn't stay static. It blended with the complex local linguistic realities and birthed entirely new, robust systems.
Right.
These global Englishes are now the major engines driving the language forward globally, adding thousands of new words and idioms to the broader global lexicon.
You know, I'm trying to think of a way to visualize this. If language is a tool, is English essentially the equivalent of the USB cable?
The USB cable.
I mean, think about it. It is not the prettiest cord. It is notoriously messy. It's clunky. You always plug it in the wrong way on the first try, which is exactly like dealing with English spelling.
True.
It doesn't have the elegant design of, like, an Apple charger.
Right.
But because it got pushed out by massive tech empires early on, it has become the universal standard. It connects absolutely everything. You have a drawer full of beautiful, specialized cables you never use, but you always reach for the ugly USB because it just works.
That is a brilliant, highly accurate analogy. English is a utility language. It emphasizes modular structure and vocabulary flexibility over purity or grammatical elegance.
Right.
That makes it incredibly good at coordinating action between absolute strangers. It became the most useful shared platform on the planet.
But to truly understand this power dynamic, to really feel what it means for a language to be the USB cable backed by an empire, we have to look at the ghost of what could have been.
Yes. This is crucial.
Our sources dedicate a fascinating section to a language that grew up right next to English, shared its exact DNA, but didn't get the backing of the printing presses and the state power. Let's look at Scots.
This is perhaps the most illuminating comparison in our entire stack of source material. But first, we need to make a major clarification because there is a lot of confusion around this.
Oh, definitely.
Scots is not simply English spoken with a Scottish accent,
Right.
nor is it Scottish Gaelic.
Right. Let's separate those. Gaelic is a completely different branch of the language tree. It's a Celtic language, ancient to the islands.
Exactly. Scots, on the other hand, is a West Germanic language. It is a closely related sibling to English. They both descended from the exact same broad Old English Anglic stream that we talked about earlier. But while the English dialect in London was being shaped by the Normans and the printing presses, Scots was developing its own distinct literary, phonological, and grammatical traditions up in lowland Scotland.
So they are literal siblings.
Yeah.
But one sibling went on to run a ruthless global corporate empire, and the other sibling stayed home in the village.
That is a very evocative and fairly accurate way to put it. The core contrast between the two today is emotional and institutional.
How so?
English, backed by London, became the language of sheer scale, of global commerce, mass centralized schooling, and international access. Scots remained deeply rooted. It remained the language of intimacy, of local texture, of memory, and of specific local Scottish identity.
But reading the history, it wasn't exactly a peaceful, happy coexistence, was it? There was a massive, sustained power imbalance between the siblings.
There was an immense power imbalance. Following the political union of Scotland and England, Standard English aggressively expanded through the formal schooling system, the church, and government administration.
And what did that do to Scots?
This actively pushed Scots into a much lower prestige position. English was treated as the language of official seriousness, of advancement, of intellect.
And Scots was just pushed aside.
Tragically, it was often stigmatized by the authorities as improper or labeled as just bad English spoken by the uneducated. Even though Scots has a rich, centuries-old, highly sophisticated literary tradition championed by writers like Robert Burns.
But Scots didn't die. The notes explicitly mention the 2022 census, where over 1.5 million people in Scotland reported that they could speak Scots.
Yes.
And the Scottish government is actively implementing policies right now to raise its status, fund its literature, and increase its public recognition.
Yes, it is very much alive and experiencing a vital resurgence. And when linguists compare the inner feel of the two languages, the divergence is striking.
The feel.
Yes. English and Scots share a very similar SVO grammatical syntax, so they aren't alien to each other structurally, but their vocabularies have a completely different center of gravity.
The sources put it so beautifully. They said, English has a word ready for administration, but Scots has a word ready for recognition.
What's truly fascinating here, and what this whole deep dive really points toward, is that comparing English and Scots isn't really a linguistic comparison at all.
No.
It is a pure power comparison. It proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that languages rise, fall, or get marginalized based on institutional backing, military might, and economic force, not because one language is inherently better, more logical, or more sophisticated than the other.
Wow.
English had the printing press, the London courts, the Royal Navy, and the Empire. Scots had local legitimacy.
Let me just sit with that for a second.
Yeah.
Because if we look back at what we said about English, it's excellent at procedural abstraction. It gives us words like liberty, justice, procedural equality, accountability.
Right.
But Scots is vastly stronger at evoking a specific, physical, local, emotional world, which leads to this almost tragic philosophical realization.
What's that?
If English says, be widely understood by millions of strangers, and Scots says, be recognizably of this specific community, is there an inevitable trade-off? Did English win massive global scale, but in the process, lose its local soul?
That is the defining tension of the English language today. English won global scale, and in doing so, it had to become somewhat smoothed out.
Smoothed out.
It had to become a utility language of outward mobility, a pragmatic tool for strangers doing business across borders. Scots kept its soul, its rich texture, its regional warmth, and its deep humor, but at the painful cost of being historically suppressed by the very institutions that elevated its sibling.
That's powerful.
Thinking in English feels like organizing reality for mass transfer. Thinking in Scots feels like speaking from deep inside a place rather than floating in the boardroom above it.
That really crystallizes the entire journey we've been on.
Okay, we've covered an immense amount of ground today, from Viking farmers to internet algorithms. Let's try to distill this massive Frankenstein operating system into a core takeaway for the listener.
If we synthesize all the historical, linguistic, and psychological source material we've explored, the definitive thesis is this. English is a hybrid language radically optimized for communication across differences.
Right.
It is endlessly absorbent, highly procedural, and deeply historically loaded with political power. It acts simultaneously as a bridge connecting the globe and a bulldozer flattening local linguistic ecosystems.
So what does this all mean for you, the person listening to this right now?
Good question.
It means that tomorrow morning, when you sit down to write a professional email, and you consciously delete a blunt Germanic word and choose a softer Latin-based word to gently dial down the hierarchy with your boss.
Which we all do. Or the next time you use a procedural project management phrase like, let's get the ball rolling, or the next time you verb a noun and tell a friend to Google it, you are not just typing. You are actively participating in a chaotic, thousand-year-old tradition of linguistic pragmatism.
You are.
You are using a messy tool built by muddy peasants, invading Vikings, French lords, stressed-out printing press operators, and modern internet algorithms. You are remixing the debris of history every time you open your mouth.
You are operating a machine built for rough, practical reality, not for pristine perfection.
But I want to leave you with one final, deeply provocative thought to mull over, something that wasn't fully resolved in our notes.
Okay.
We mentioned earlier that English is currently spoken by 1.49 billion people, and the vast, overwhelming majority of them are not native speakers. We've established that English is a purely practical tool that morphs and bends based on whoever needs to use it. So what happens in the next 100 years? As these massive global Englishes in places like India, Nigeria, and across the digital world grow even more powerful and populous, do these so-called native speakers in London or New York completely lose control of how the language evolves?
That's a huge shift to imagine.
Will the global internet, driven largely by brilliant non-native speakers mixing English with their own syntax, create a totally new, streamlined, hyper-efficient global dialect? One that leaves traditional standard English behind entirely.
It is a very real and thrilling possibility. The English operating system is fully open source now.
It really is. The X-ray machine is broken, the linguistic waters are incredibly muddy, and the Frankenstein monster is officially loose on the global network, mutating faster than ever. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the tools you use to think.